Big book weekend for me. Spent a lot of the weekend reading because I had a hot one in my hands, holding it right now. It's called The Prince, The Turbulent Reign of Justin Trudeau. Man behind the book is Stephen Maher. He's been writing about Canadian politics since 1989. Stephen, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me on.
I love the book, Stephen. Really, I read through it it took me 3 days. I read this thing in 3 days. I loved it so much. When did this start? When did you start saying, okay, I have to write about Justin Trudeau's rise and his years in office? When did that come to you? When did you start this?
October 2022, Simon & Schuster asked me if I would think about doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about it for about 24 hours. When I was a journalist in Ottawa, to sort of do my homework when I was covering politics, I read all the classic Canadian political books, and I always had it in mind that I'd like to try to write one as good as the books by Peter Newman and John Sawatsky and Lawrence Martin. So I set out then.
Yep.
And it was a lot of interviews, a lot of typing, a lot of research, and now I'm trying to sell it.
Absolutely. And hopefully we'll sell a few books this morning because it really is that good. Now, it's called The Prince. You reference Machiavelli throughout the beginning of chapters in the book here. And you also, man, there's one point where you talk about the bubble that Trudeau lives in, sort of self-importance and even narcissism. So let's talk about that from the title of the book and just, Justin Trudeau and his own sense of self-importance. Well, you tackle that many times in this book. Let's talk about that.
Okay, well, I am not saying that he's a narcissist because I'm not a mental health practitioner. But what I learned is that a number of people who had worked with him say that.
Yeah.
So it arose as sort of a question in my mind, and I started to ask people, well, some people think he's narcissistic. What do you think? And I ended up sort of having two conflicting opinions on that from people who know him well. One is, yes, he's narcissistic. He's an attention-seeking person who's validated by public attention. And then there were other people who said, no, what you don't know about him is how kind he is to the people around him and how much he cares about the country. So it set up this kind of conflict in my brain. And then I spoke to one old friend of his who said, well, what makes you decide that you are going to be prime minister? The implication being that anyone who kind of seeks that job has to have an element of narcissism. Otherwise, you'd never decide that you alone among all of Canadians are the one who should lead the country.
It sort of seems, Stephen, that you vacillate between the two viewpoints throughout the book, right? And talking about some triumphs and obviously the scandals and that. Where do you land? I know you talk to a lot of people, but you've also interviewed the Prime Minister a lot. You've covered him throughout your career. Where do you land on that? The vanity side, the self-importance side of the Prime Minister?
Well, he would not have been able to do the things he did to lead the country for good or ill if he didn't have this tremendous drive, this tremendous sense of himself. So it's who he is, and it's why he managed to do all these things. I mean, when you consider that at the time that he starts, and I was there in Papineau in 2012 when he declared, he was a former high school teacher and backbench MP with no legislation to speak of, no prominent role in committee work. And he decided that he should lead the country because Canadians felt that they knew him. He had a connection and a knowledge of the country.
Mm-hmm.
So for me as a student of his career, it's not so much that I have an opinion about it. I'm just you observe it. Like, this isn't it an unusual leader compared with the earlier prime ministers.
Now, here's one opinion. Here's a direct quote from your book that I underlined several times. He seems to have ambiguous feelings about Canada. And I read that, Stephen, and at times I felt the same way about him. What did you mean by that, and why is that an important part of Justin Trudeau and his story as Prime Minister?
Well, I should say that I think he understands the country well and has a vision of it that he wants to defend, similar to his father's vision. But the ambiguous feelings have to do, I think, with the legacy of colonialism and racism around, in particular, Indigenous people, which I think you have to give him credit for having worked harder at that, not always successfully, than predecessors, and work that is out of proportions to any votes he would hope to get from it, I think. But there's times, where you think, where I think his own failings or struggles ended up holding us back. And the clear example there is the first National Day of Reconciliation, which he created, and which I believe was a good day, a good idea. It comes out of the Orange Shirt movement, right? Its roots are grassroots in Indigenous communities. It takes place in September when they used to take the kids to the residential schools where terrible things happen. And he skipped that day to go to Tofino with his family, which was a big failure, big mess up, and then put a sort of shadow over him. And then when they found what appeared to be graves at some of these residential schools, he brought the flag down and left it down for 6 months, right? Like that, as a symbol of national unity, that flag should not stay down for 6 months, in my opinion. And it looks as though it stayed down because of his ambiguous feelings and his own personal shortcoming in that incident with the National Day of Reconciliation. That's the kind of thing I'm trying to get at there.
We're with Stephen Maher, author of The Prince, The Turbulent Reign of Justin Trudeau. So you mentioned missing the first Truth and Reconciliation Day, being out on vacation. You also bring up the fact that he missed Canada's birthday as well. He was on vacation for that, and bad stories about his vacations that come up. What do you think leads to that? That there's so many examples of him taking a vacation at the wrong time, or taking a vacation that's not going to go over well with the Canadian public, ethics issues aside. What do you think that gets down to?
One of the things that I learned when I researched his most recent vacation that got bad headlines was at a resort in Jamaica that his friends, the Greens, picked up the bill for him. He jumped down there a day after doing a round of interviews, in which he talked about how seriously he was taking the cost of living crisis. And then he's taking a luxurious free vacation from his rich friends, which looked bad, right? That looks bad. And it's got to have his people, team members, banging their heads against the wall, right? We don't need this. So what is it? Well, that is a place that he first went when he was in diapers with his father and his mother. He wants to take his kids to this place that has importance in his life. And he was likely hoping to spend some time and reconnect with his estranged wife, Sophie. So I asked him about it, and I told him that I didn't think that was a good call, and he said it's an impossible balance. And he pointed out that when he takes he wants to go, like any dad, to see his kids play basketball, or and sometimes they say, "Well, I don't want you there because it turns into a circus." So that's how he would explain it to his friends or people around him, that he does these things because he's torn between his family and his public obligations. But it's a bit hard for people like me who've never even been to a place like that to understand why you can't just
take one
set
trip
that
around
aside.
the corner. Take one trip where you just take a nice drive somewhere. Just one of those vacations, right? That's always what I would keep thinking in that subject. Continuing our discussion with Stephen Maher, author of The Prince, The Turbulent Reign of Justin Trudeau, out in bookstores this week. Stephen, thanks for sticking around with us. I want to talk about the section of your book. You call it Walking into the Rake. And it's such an interesting part of your book because you look at some doozy scandals, SNC-Lavalin, Jody Wilson-Raybould. You also give him some praise, by the way, on NAFTA and how he handled that negotiation. Let's talk about walking into the rake and that part of Justin Trudeau's legacy. What did you mean by that? And let's take a look maybe first at the scandals that have plagued him.
Well, that came from an interview with a former staffer who was watching after their departure and saying, "Why do they keep walking into rakes?" And politics is hard. Running the country is hard, and they made mistakes. The SNC-Lavalin one, and this is a Montreal show, I spent more time working on that, trying to understand it, than any other part of the book, because I felt it's really important. And I tried to write about it, focusing in part on Canada and corruption and how we stack up internationally, which is not always great, right? So this country, based in Montreal, this company rather, had been carrying on. They are no longer doing these things, I don't believe, or there's no reason to believe so, in a way that was spreading corruption around the world, not just in Libya and other places. And when that happens, we have signed international agreements that say that there's a limit to how easy you can take it on these guys. If international fight against corruption is going to work, there has to be penalties. And there were a lot of powerful people in Canada, in Montreal, in Ottawa, and Toronto who were trying to prevent that from happening. And Trudeau and his team listened to them instead of listening to Jody Wilson-Raybould, who I believe was correct on the substance of the matter. That if you look closely at the legal obligations of the government of Canada, she was right and they were wrong. There is another view, and that the people who believe that aren't necessarily crazy and stupid, but I think the Trudeau people were wrong, and they ended up paying a terrible price for it.
I got to say, Stephen, one of the reasons I loved your book so much is that, it's been a while. It's a decade of Justin Trudeau, and you forget all of these things that happened, and you so succinctly put together the SNC-Lavalin affair. It also touches upon one of the major criticisms of Justin Trudeau, the virtue signaling of, gender parity and making a big play on the fact that we have an Indigenous justice minister. And then when push comes to shove, just how they treated her behind the scenes. So let's talk about that, and maybe it leads to what we're discussing about narcissism and self-importance, that kind of thing. That the difference between Justin Trudeau and what he says at times and what he does in the background. What's your take?
Yeah, that's the kind of conclusion that I want to leave readers to come up with their own opinion about that, because I don't want to tell people what to think, if you know what I mean. Yeah. I've given them enough information they can come up with their own decisions. One thing I'll say to try to be kind to him and to that team is that when they got elected back in 2015, they had promised to do things differently and to bring a different kind of coalition together, and to reflect the country, the diversity of the country in the cabinet. That was a huge deal that he had 50% women. And to do that did mean that they had to have people like Jody Wilson-Raybould, Bill Morneau, Jane Philpott, who had not been at that level in politics before. So the seeds of their difficulties were kind of planted when they put that cabinet together, right? Traditionally, you would want more experienced people, but they had promised to do things differently. And that's one of those things in politics you hear, we're going to do politics differently. And I always think, Well, no, you're not. You're going to do it the same way other
Yeah.
people have.
Yeah.
I remember thinking that when Quebec Solidaire had a big election and they were saying, we're doing it differently. And you're like, not
No,
really.
no,
No.
yeah, that's right. So, Stephen, listen, I want to say that I appreciate what you're saying there. You want to leave it to the readers there. I'll tell you as a reader, there were two sections of the book that were the most damning to Trudeau and his reign as prime minister. One was the SNC-Lavalin stuff. The other one was China and foreign interference. Take us through what you needed to do to get the true story, the background on foreign interference.
Well, I talked to a lot of people and did a lot of research on that. There are big things that it is impossible to know where you're interviewing people and they say, well, I can't talk about that. I've taken an oath. And, but, so you can't really get to the bottom of it. But because of the work of Sam Cooper out in Vancouver and Bob Fife and Steve Chase at the Globe, we have a pretty good idea that they were not taking it seriously enough. I hope that we'll eventually learn more about this because there's a sort of question mark where the worst case scenario would be the Liberals are sitting back and saying, oh, the Chinese are interfering in our election. And that's good because they're going after those terrible, racist, nasty Tories. Right? And I hope that's not the case. But it's the one section of the book where I end up being perplexed, I guess, by the failure of the government to deal adequately with this stuff. Because it should be more important. They should have done more to cope with this. It's now been, I think, 4 years since Australia brought in a foreign agent registry. I can see why they would be acting a little bit more quickly than Canada because it's a more serious threat to Australia. It's so close and such a big part of their economy, their trade with China. But I do not understand why the Trudeau government did not bring in a foreign agent registry sooner, except that there's a lot of people in Canadian politics who make a lot of money representing the views of China and India and Saudi Arabia, and that would include people that help the Liberals.
Yeah, and I got to say, Stephen, that's another example of where you let the listeners decide. You lay out the case, you let the listeners decide. Now, having said that, and this is on the foreign affairs vein, you do get, I would say, a cutting jab in. And so I want to read you a direct quote from your book here. You're talking about foreign affairs, and you're talking about Melanie Joly. And you write this: Joly's appointment sent a message that foreign affairs was not a priority for Canada. I read that. I said, "Ouch." Stephen, what about that? You at times you do go down that path where you got to get some of your thoughts in.
Yeah, no. With that appointment, she had been in the penalty box after having struggled earlier in her career as a cabinet minister, and under both Harper and Trudeau, we'd cycled through foreign affairs ministers. There's more change than is ideal. I think she has since grown into, but she certainly made a lot of mistakes early on, would have to be clarifying things. And it is not who you would have put there if you were focused on the issue, right? Like, it's the kind of thing that no doubt would have pleased her. She's very important politically to the government, an important organizer in Quebec. But it's an example of it, and there's a number here, and it's in the Trudeau government, and not just the Trudeau government, the previous government, you could make similar conclusions, is that they are treating foreign affairs as if for political reasons, instead of focusing on the national interest in the way that we should. And that's because Canada is so far from other countries, and it's typically not an important election issue. But I think that we, across the political spectrum, we need to smarten up. The world's become more dangerous, and I think that ultimately that's one thing that history is going to look at the Trudeau government unkindly on that front.
Stephen, they say timing is everything. The timing certainly is right for this book. Everything we know about what's happening in polling, and you cover the rise of Pierre Poilievre as well in part in this book. Thank you so much for joining us. I really, really love the book.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. Thanks very much.
Stephen Maher right there, author of The Prince, The Turbulent Reign of Justin Trudeau.